welcome to episode 11 of the Power Score LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
That's right. I'm Jon Dinning down in Los Angeles.
Tonight we're going to talk about necessary assumption questions, which we also just call regular assumption questions around here.
That's right.
But the most important thing, John, really above all else in life sometimes is, what are you drinking tonight?
Yeah, speaking of necessary, I was feeling a little low energy this evening, so I am drinking coffee, the caffeine being necessary, with some Irish whiskey in it. Also feeling pretty necessary at the moment.
Why are you so low energy?
I think it's mostly your fault. That game last night also took a lot out of me. The final of the March Madness, which we'll talk about more in a second, I think. But yeah, I'm feeling the collective effects of the last several days.
Yes, and obviously most people wouldn't know that you were actually up here with a mutual friend of ours.
That's right.
Who was visiting San Francisco on a business trip and then convinced all of us to get together. Yeah. And as usual, that was a terrible mistake.
Yeah, despite all that, he's still a mutual friend, but a little less so.
He'll always be a mutual friend. It's just a mistake to hang out with him that late every night.
Yeah, well, thank you for the hospitality, I think.
As always.
Yeah, it was fun. What are you drinking?
I've taken it a little bit low key tonight. I'm just having a couple of beers. I'm going to have a Dos Equis and then a Pacifico at some point, and we'll see if I can scrounge anything else up.
There you go. Yeah.
I'm not going to go too heavy.
See how many you can put away in the next hour. Yeah,
something along those lines. Also, I need to keep it like low key. It's not like I'm going to drink straight vodka tonight or anything crazy. So what is the music for the evening when we're talking about assumption questions?
Well, we've gone old school, but in a different direction. Most of our old school picks so far have been the classic rock variety, which I'll never tire of. Tonight, though, a little different. We've actually picked a song from the old Jungle Book cartoon movie called Bare Necessities.
Which is actually the closing song in that movie.
I didn't even realize where it occurred. 1967? Is that what that movie is?
That is the case. It's one of those Disney movies, animated, and obviously the choice here when it's sung by a bear, actually, if I recall correctly.
Baloo, I think, is that bear.
And the actual word though isn't B-E-A-R, it's B-A-R-E.
Correct.
Necessities, and of course, when we talk about assumptions, as we will see, the idea of being the bare necessity is really very closely connected with that particular idea. So that's kind of the connection that's going there. And if you are like a Disney fan, the original, I haven't seen it in years, but I have heard the song recently. They also did a remake a couple of years ago, did they not?
They did, and a personal hero played the bear in the remake, Bill Murray.
Bill Murray, and a Charleston resident and often seen about town.
Yes, that's correct. I've had a few run-ins with him myself. He never fails to disappoint.
Something that I miss about Charleston, and that would be it right there.
That dude's a national treasure. I'll see if I bounce into him this weekend when I'm back in town for a wedding.
Yeah, you will be in Charleston.
That's right.
Enjoy it. One of the best cities in America.
Truly.
If somebody's listening has never been there, a truly excellent place.
Yeah. In fact, this week in general is kind of a great week. The Charleston visit obviously is high on my mind, and I'm excited about it. I happened to win the March Madness bracket, the Power Score bracket last night. No, let's dwell on this for the majority of our time.
Let's move on.
Okay.
Next item.
And of great personal interest to me, it's also Masters Week. So for any golf fans out there, this is the big one.
Yes, indeed. Congratulations to you on winning the pool. I should have won it, obviously.
I had very little to do with it.
Had the referees not repeatedly stolen victory from me, I would be the one collecting the cash. But
you finished second.
It's you. I did finish second, which in our pool means that I don't have to pay any of the fees.
Yeah.
Since I was the king of the zombies,
the
leader
nothing.
of the dead.
Yeah. And it was a close second, too, so I know you did your best, buddy. Good try. Good try.
John, I appreciate your sarcastic thank yous.
Don't hit your wagon to Duke Star, man.
Did I pick more games correct than you? But you actually picked the last one right, and so you had the higher point total.
Yeah, we either had the exact same correct, or you had one more than me. But I
had one more. Let's just state that for the record and all posterity.
All right.
But the Masters Week, since you are originally from Augusta and I used to live there, and that's where we first met, actually.
Not at the Masters, but in Augusta. Yeah.
Not at the Masters. No, I wasn't playing it that year. But in Augusta, Georgia. Yeah. I know it's close to your heart. You actually don't live that far from the course.
My parents, anyway. Yeah. I live about as far from Augusta as I can hope to get.
You do now.
I do. Intentionally.
As do I.
But my parents are still there. My grandparents are still there. Still got some friends from the old high school days. And that course is particularly special because I've had a chance to play it about 4 times now. So
it's a pretty awful course from what I've heard.
It's a real dirt track. I'm not going to get to the tournament this year, which is a little bit disappointing. But I'll be glued to a television all weekend.
Well, I will not. I am not a Masters fan, despite the fact that I live there. Maybe because of the fact that I live there. But I much prefer the Heritage over in Hilton Head, a tournament I've been to many times, and actually one of my favorite events on Hilton Head.
Very different vibe, though.
Yes, it is, and that's why I like it a lot more. It's much more of a party than, I guess, what some people would call the church-like atmosphere at Augusta, and I would call funereal. So,
I would call appropriately respectful, but to each his own. The Heritage is none of those things. The Heritage is
it's awesome. Yeah. That's why I like the Heritage so much.
I've spent 3 days in a row at the Heritage and not seen anyone hit a golf shot. But
yeah, and that's the way to do the Heritage. Yeah. So, and it's a beautiful course, man. I really like it, and Sea Pines is a gorgeous area.
It's a great spot. So anyway, that's my current sports highlights for this week. I'm very excited.
It's been a good week for you. Getting better.
Speaking of sports, you want to talk about Varsity Blues?
I was going to speak about non-highlights, really, which if you're Felicity Huffman or Lori Loughlin, you're having very interesting weeks. But we've been talking about the admission scandal for a while, off and on. And just in the last day or so, you started to see plea agreements and plea deals coming out. And I found it interesting that Felicity Huffman, who had been accused of making a $15,000 payment to have her daughter's scores altered, unbeknownst to her, she has made a plea agreement that I guess we'll have to see what happens in the sentencing, which I believe comes up in a month and a half or so.
That's right.
But she looks like she's going to be able to stay away from a really long prison term. And I think they were talking, 6 months was about the target?
I've seen
was that the case?
As a minimum get thrown around, yeah. It's hard to say anyone's handled themselves well in this, but I feel like she did about all she could.
She was, contrite about it, remorseful. She didn't play around with it. She took the first round of agreements and basically said, look, I made a mistake. I realize it. Let me get this done with.
Yeah.
And when you're
Becky
talking
took a slightly different approach.
Yes, she did. But when you're talking $15,000, it doesn't feel like it was as massive. Whereas Aunt Becky and $500,000 and lying on college applications, knowingly that her 2 daughters had never rode crew.
Yeah.
It feels a lot heavier. And I guess her attorneys have advised her not to take the initial plea agreement. So they actually added I think it's a money laundering charge onto what she's been accused of. So we'll have to see. She's got some heavy hitting attorneys. I wonder how they'll work this out. But one of them used to be very high up or the head of the DOJ. So she's got people in her corner that know what they're talking about.
Is that the Enron guy?
A lot of criticism. What's that?
Is that the Enron guy?
Yeah. The guy who handled the Enron case and was able to bring successful cases against several of the head guys like the guys Skillet and Lay and those dudes.
Yeah, well, we'll see how it all shakes out, but it's hard to think Loughlin's. I think the quote that I saw today is, boy, she's really rolling those dice. And we will see.
Well, she said she would rather, go to trial than go to prison. And I'm like, sometimes you get both, so be careful.
Yeah, it's not an either or, Loughlin.
No, it really isn't. You need to remember that. And of course, either or could mean both. So that's exactly what we may get in this particular instance. Anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about what's been going on in the LSAT world this week.
Yeah, well, the streak continues of not much. It's been a pretty quiet week once again, which is what you're going to expect right on the heels of an LSAT from last weekend, 2 weekends ago.
Yeah, exactly. You had a big test. Obviously, there's not an immediate pressure. There's not an immediate registration deadline that comes up typically.
Right.
In the future, there will be when they get to every single month. But right now,
I think the 29th of this month might be a deadline that I recall.
Yeah, so we still got time, but it's pretty low key. In fact, only 2 things actually occurred this week.
The first more interesting, in my opinion, by the way, if you're going to talk about the data.
I don't think there's any question that was the more interesting of the 2. But the two things they did was they released one of their infamously short podcasts and then also one of their law:fully blogs. And so the data one, I like what they're doing with this. I would love to see them expand it and talk about the data a little bit more. But Susan Krinsky, who actually does the recording, she shared a little bit of some of the things they're seeing. And I love that. I wish they would do more of that. There's no proprietary value in some of the information that is locked up. And if they shared it, it would be really helpful. I think just even for LSAT students to hear some of this.
Yeah, and I think there's some encouraging news in this as well.
Yeah, there really is. They talked about the fact that JD applicants are pretty much the same. And I didn't think that was the biggest deal that was out there, but we talked about that. I think it was a couple of weeks ago when the last one came out that it was trending right to what it had been last year.
Yeah, less than 1% up, I think, year to year.
Although when they get down into the number of people who have actually registered for the tests for this year compared to last year, you had 4 test administrations and they had about 140,000 registrants. This year with 6, they're up to 151,000. So they're up like 7.5%. And the majority of those are first-time registrants.
Which I thought was fascinating. Yeah.
But 45% of them are repeaters. And I think that tells you how the idea of repeating to get a better score is really taking hold.
Yeah.
And we've talked before about how someone taking the LSAT 2, 3, 4 times is really not abnormal anymore. And so I think we're going to start to see more and more of that, particularly this cycle. I've heard from a lot of students who are like, look, I've taken it 3 times, but I'm going to do it again because there's just no harm in it. And they're starting to hear that word from various law school administrators and adcoms and so forth.
Yeah, I think we're actually going to reach a point here in a couple of years. This is off speculative, we'll see, but where someone taking it just once becomes strange. That becomes attention getting.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you try
that
again?
Idea of you've maxed out, whereas, well, maybe you could have done 2 points better. And at a number of schools, 1 or 2 points can make a difference. So I think that's kind of cool. She did actually share this little bit of information, which I thought was kind of cool. She said she looked at the data and that a significant number of people that are registered for LSATs will cancel in the 24 hours prior to the test date. That's not a big surprise. Somebody's like, oh my God, the test is tomorrow. I'm freaking out. I'm not ready. They cancel.
Right.
She said, though, sometimes as many as 2,000 people will cancel their registration.
The day before.
Yeah.
Which is technically withdrawal, but yes, that's
cancel their registration, withdrawal, either way. Right. You're talking about, in some cases, that's like 10% of the people registered. That is a lot of individuals who were like, yeah, I'm bailing. A lot of last minute decisions there.
Right.
Because she was talking about in the 24 hours prior. And I found that fascinating. We knew it was a high number. I don't think I realized it was quite that high, but now we know. And that's the kind of stuff that I really like to hear from them in terms of like data. It's benign. It doesn't advantage anybody to know it or not know it, but it is certainly something that if you were thinking to yourself, I don't know if I'm ready, I might have to withdraw. Hey, you're not alone.
Yeah.
There's a ton of other people out there. That's really good for people to understand that nobody is really alone in this process. Everybody's had their frustrations.
It's exactly what you would expect when you've got another test a month or 2 away, as opposed to having to wait 4 months, as it used to be.
That's exactly right.
I wonder, Dave, what they're doing logistically in terms of this. Do you think they overbook test centers the way an airline books seats or a hotel books rooms? If they know 2,000 people, maybe 10% are going to withdraw the day before.
I'm sure they have some yield management going on there. I would imagine that's part of her job. So,
I suspect so.
You know, to see that. I would also imagine that right now they probably are rolling extra capacity because things are so uncertain.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're in a period of great change in terms of the number of LSATs being administered with the digital LSAT coming. I would imagine that they are trying to prepare for the worst or the greatest volume kind of scenarios as opposed to the minimum.
That's just far more erratic than I think I would have anticipated.
That's a tough thing to deal with, to be honest with you.
Yeah. And then, of course, there was a blog, the law:fully blog.
You've taken up my naming of it, right?
It's irresistible. I have to piggyback right on there.
I'm pretty sure everybody's using that these days because how can you not?
It's great. Another diversity-focused blog, which I'm really enjoying, honestly, this series.
This wasn't my favorite one, but that was because I feel like it was a little more low-key. I like the first generation story slightly more, but so be it. That's the way they do it, and that's what they chose to focus on. I don't think there's a whole lot in there for LSAT students, so we're just going to move right over it. which very fortunately and timely brings us to the main topic of the evening, which is, as I said before, necessary assumption questions.
Which we will refer to from long tradition in economy for the rest of tonight, I think, as just assumption.
Why is it that we do that? Do you know?
I do know, in large part because we play deference or victim to the fact that there's not a standardized name for this stuff throughout the industry. There's another, quote, assumption question type, sufficient assumptions, that gets batted around. And these two are sufficiently distinct from one another that you have to be very careful in referencing them. If we just called it assumption and people weren't clear that we meant necessary versus sufficient, we would do a disservice, frankly.
Yeah, in fact, what's happened is it's evolved to where I really use two names for each of the question types. So you have what these days is often referred to as necessary assumptions and sufficient assumptions.
Right.
But one has to realize that historical kind of development comes because when LSAT started talking about these questions, I think in one of the super preps or the very first one, that's what they termed them as. However, we had started teaching students these question types prior to any question usage they had ever had. And so when we began doing it, I looked at this and we'd already been teaching assumption questions for years. Sure. And so we kept with the idea of an assumption question. So when you hear me typically say assumption, I mean necessary assumption, right, which is what we're talking about tonight. And the questions that became eventually known as sufficient assumption questions, I called those justify the conclusion questions, because that to me is a much more accurate description of the act that you have to engage in to solve those questions. So, when you think about it, I could quibble with the idea of the sufficient assumption name as being inaccurate,
or at least unhelpful.
Not wholly accurate, let's put it that way, because an assumption being something that you take as true, and these sufficient assumptions, they can have extra things in them that don't really have to be taken for true, that you're just going to for that part, which is why I never really thought to myself, I'm going to call it a sufficient assumption. I understood how it operated in the context of conditional reasoning,
sure,
as a whole, which we will certainly talk about here in a minute. But that's why you will see us refer to sufficient assumption questions also as justify the conclusion questions.
It's just a more informative nomenclature anyway. It tells you the task, justify the conclusion. I know what I'm doing. Sufficient assumption. Sufficient for what? Now, yeah, I know the answer to that. That's a rhetorical question, but the average person hearing it is like, what is that even?
I had a call from somebody a couple of years ago, and they jumped on the phone and started yelling at me that, they just discovered sufficient assumption questions, and they were furious that we hadn't taught that to them. And, I listened to the abuse because you don't want to interrupt somebody who's, furiously yelling at you. And then at the end, I was like, hey, did you ever do these justify questions? And they're like, yeah, well, of course, everybody knows how to do those. And I was like, that's the same question type.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes there's a little bit of confusion there, but they calm down immediately. Like, oh, I didn't realize that. And then, of course, I'm really sorry I yelled at you. And I was like, it's okay. I think the LSAT was in like 5 days. And in the 5 days prior to a test, the pressure and the nerves and the anxiety goes through the roof. So
tempers run high. That's an interesting bit of history, Dave. I would have guessed that our terminology predated LSACs, but I don't know that I recalled that the sufficient assumption was their choice, and that's why it kind of gained some traction in the industry.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies didn't really have the question covered. Mm-hmm. Some of the bigger names out there, I don't think were really aware of the fact that there'd been a split and that they were now actively mining the justify/sufficient assumption side. And so when LSAT came out and started talking about it, they were like, oh boy, we better get on this train. And so they just naturally gravitated towards that particular usage.
Yeah, I'll tell you another hesitation I've always had when it comes to those labels, necessary versus sufficient. I think they run a real risk of living too close to one another. I think a lot of people look at them as too similar. And that's dangerous, as we'll cover not just tonight, but in the next episode when we look more at justify.
Yeah, and that's really the key here, is that this is a two-part approach. We're going to talk about the necessary assumption side, and then in the next episode, barring some kind of crazy occurrence in the LSAT world, we will talk about the sufficient assumption/justify side of this whole equation.
Yeah, I've got to survive Charleston, so let's not make too hard of plans at this point, but
Well, if you're not around, I will just do it on my own. How's that?
No, I thank you for being so sentimental about it. Take at least a week off to mourn.
Everyone else will thank me. You're going to survive, and I would be bummed out if you didn't.
Oh, well,
so
that's very sweet of you.
Let's talk a little bit about this. Let's focus on the necessary assumption aside and really talk about what is an assumption of the argument. I mean, how would you define it?
Well, I think the first place to start is with the broader categorization of family types that we use. So when I look at assumption, it's impossible, I think, to talk about them absent their sibling question types, things like strengthen and justify, frankly. All of these are designed in some way to add or supplement an author's argument in a helpful fashion. To me, the only distinction between those three types, assumption, strengthen, and justify, is the degree to which you help.
Or the requirement that you have to meet. How much better
are we making the argument with each of these steps or stages? An assumption is the lowest level of this. I've heard you analogize this before to you do this with arguments very nicely, I think, to a house or a table, for instance. And assumptions are really the foundation of these kinds of things. If a table leg is a premise and a table top is the conclusion that lives above everything else, assumptions are really the bedrock upon which everything stands. That's the foundational, fundamental part. You used the word requirement a second ago, and that's really what it is. Like lowest level basement necessity.
Okay.
So that's how I tend to think of them. And again, why it's so important to take those versus justify, sufficient assumption, and make sure you have them categorically distinctive, because a justify question doesn't operate that way, or at least it doesn't have to.
Yeah, they're like brother and sister when you look at those two. And especially when you're talking about straight assumption, necessary assumption questions, it's really easy to start comparing them. And you mentioned that second family model and the idea of we're trying to help the argument in some way. Well, when you identify an assumption, which to me is, really an unstated premise, it's something that the author took as true on the way to making that argument or putting it together.
Yeah.
So you have that. When you bring that to light and you enunciate it and you identify it, you've done something that's really positive for the argument.
I think this is one of the, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but one of the counterintuitive elements to assumption questions is it's such a fundamental thing. It is so central as a truth for that argument that the author didn't even feel the need to make it explicit.
Yeah, they just jumped right over it.
It's such a given.
It's almost like you guys already know all this.
Of course, you agree with me.
I'm going to get to the real meat of the argument.
Right.
And of course, it's not always how it works. And you see people make assumptions all the time. And in our courses and in the Logical Reasoning Bible, I talk about how the world is made up of assumptions.
Right.
And I think the example that I use there is you walk into a restaurant and as soon as you start speaking, you begin to make assumptions like they're going to understand you. They're going to accept the money that you give them, that the food is going to be as described.
That this place sells food.
So
yeah.
Yeah, that they are even a store for food.
That menu I'm looking at, that's your stuff, right?
Yeah, that the pictures of food up on the wall, that's sold here, right? Yeah, it goes all the way down to stuff that's really fundamental. And that in our world, if you didn't really just accept a whole bunch of assumptions right out of the gate, life would be terrible. Yeah. You'd have to start with a series of the most basic questions in the world just to get anything done. And nobody really wants to have to deal with that or go through it.
I think assumptions have this almost pejorative to them, though. People hear the word assumption, and what's the old, you assumed you made an ass of you and me? That's where it always... But an assumption's not a bad thing. It's just something the author's taken to be so true as to not need stating.
Basic assumptions are really good.
Yes.
They allow our world to work in a really smooth and easy way. It's when the assumption gets too big or it's too great of a leap, that's where we start having problems. That's where people disagree. Especially online. And, that's where LSAT starts to say, can you please identify this in a question?
Sure.
What's the missing piece that we actually have? And that's one way to look at them, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't like that assumption is necessarily correlated to this idea of a mistake. It's just a missing piece. It could be a mistake, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, certainly. Right. But that missing piece idea, a premise is part of an argument. And we get so used to the idea of these premises are stated and now we're drawing our conclusion. To me, an assumption just lines up with those. You just can't see it. And so you were talking about argument analogies before in the table. And of course, my favorite is the house, which is you started to get into that where it's the foundation of your house. To me, that's a lot like the assumption. Right. or assumptions, you'd thrown out the idea of like, well, what about a pillar that is load bearing, but you can't see it? It's inside the wall.
Right.
That's also an assumption. And the walls themselves that you can see are the premises. And then you have the roof, which is like the conclusion. And so it's a really integral part of the argument. And in some ways, it's helping keep it all together, but it's just not visible because the author chose not to actually state it in an outright or clear fashion.
Yeah.
Just jumped right over it.
Which takes you back to the necessary and the necessary assumption part. It's so fundamental. It's so required that it needs to be there for the argument to even have a chance to survive.
Something that the author took as true on the way to making that particular argument, a point that'll come up a little bit later. But when we look at this as conditional, the reason that they talk about this as a necessary assumption is relating to the argument itself and the validity of the conclusion. Like when you look at an argument and you say, all right, I have a valid conclusion. Well, one of the things is that the assumptions will have to be true for that. For your conclusion to be a valid one, your assumptions also have to be true or valid. And so as you look at that, that's a conditional relationship. It's kind of like conclusion, arrow, assumptions, where you need to have those assumptions be the case. And so the assumption's sitting on the necessary side there, hence the name necessary assumption.
Yeah.
So you can actually see it when you think about it from a theoretical standpoint. And to me, when I think about LSAT questions and various types, the way assumptions work are among the most interesting from a theoretical standpoint. It's also one of the most unusual tasks that you have on this test. Because let's say you do like a flaw in the reasoning question. You read the problem, you're like, where's the mistake? And then you're looking for it in the answers.
Right.
Or a parallel question where you're like, all right, what did they do? And now I'm going to go ahead and find the argument that's as identical as possible. Or you weaken an argument and you're like, okay, what'll attack this? But in each instance, even those different question types, you're looking at the stimulus and saying, all right, what's going on there? And now I'm going to try to do something with that or to it. Mm-hmm. In an assumption question, you actually go back in time. You're not as focused on exactly what's happening on the page. You're trying to go back and think, well, what did the author think on the way to making this particular argument? And that is a really weird task. Yeah. It's unique on this exam to have to go back in time and figure out, well, what were they thinking on, when they put this all together?
Yeah, I love that time travel description. What did this author believe before he even started typing this or saying this thing?
Yeah. What was she thinking when she said, this is going to be my conclusion? What's missing here?
Yeah.
So,
Dave, you said something earlier, and I want to maybe draw it out one step further to put a clarifying point on this. You mentioned the idea that if a conclusion in any argument is going to be valid, it immediately shows that the assumptions underneath that argument have to be true. And that's a correct statement. Let me go one bit further, though, and you tell me if you still agree with this. For a conclusion to even be possible, to even be remotely acceptable, the assumptions have to be true. Not just for that conclusion. That conclusion's right, so we know the assumptions. But this conclusion survives further consideration.
I'm following you.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Would you say that
I'm going to let you explain this while I drink beer. Well, by all means, drink up. So the idea that if something is necessary, if it's the oxygen to the argument itself, which is really what an assumption is, it's the lifeblood that needs to be there for that argument to exist. It's not just that the conclusion's valid with the assumption or that the conclusion being valid shows the assumption. It's that as soon as that conclusion can even survive some scrutiny, you know the things that the author predicated it on. Those beliefs that were so foundational, those must be true as well. So instead of saying conclusion valid, I'm saying conclusion even potential. Fair enough. I think when I stated that, certainly in writing, I was very, very careful about stating it because as soon as you get into something broader, sometimes you find things at the edges that could be problematic, but that is a good way to think about it. I often used to tell students that what you're thinking about with an assumption is like this minimalist thing.
Yes.
The author's got to have it. He or she is looking at the argument and they're like, I've believed this on the way. And I think that's your oxygen / lifeblood analogy, that the author was like, this is something that is absolutely essential. I may not say it, but I'm relying, wholly upon it.
Yeah, I depend on it.
Yeah. Now, interestingly enough, when we kind of move from that particular idea, there's a lot that we can actually do with it. But one of the things that for me, as I looked at LSAT questions over the years, that I noticed was that they tended to send these assumptions into two types of answer choices. They're all assumptions. They all are really the same type of idea. But the two answer choices really fit two basic models. And for those of you who have taken a course with us or read like the Logical Reasoning Bible, you're probably familiar with what we call the supporter-defender assumption model. John, are you familiar with it?
Yeah, vaguely. You want to educate me further?
Is this the first time you're hearing of it? It was a long weekend, everybody.
Yeah, if anything, I've forgotten it. But
I might have driven all of that from your mind with it.
No, in fact, I think that this is one of the most powerful breakthroughs in a lot of ways that you had when it came to this question type, because it provided a sense of like structure. It provided a sense of consistency to what the test makers were doing.
I appreciate that. I can tell you that when I came up with it, I was like overjoyed.
Yeah.
Because I'd been having a hard time explaining the various roles that some of these assumptions would use. And certainly, as we will see when I talk about defenders,
for sure,
how to make it clear to students what was actually going on. So the two models that I'd use was I would often talk about, imagine that you are in the medieval ages and you've got a king and you are one of the king's soldiers. And it is your task to make sure that the king stays alive. Well, there's different things that you can do. One of the things you can do if you're in that position is go to the king and make sure the king has everything that is needed to survive. You know, food, all that kind of good stuff. Set it up so that there's nothing internal to the king that will just cause the king to collapse. And this is really the idea of a supporter,
right?
Somebody who's actually there to help you out. Now, in arguments, very briefly, that means it's a connecting role. Mm-hmm. You're linking people together. Maybe you're getting the king to link up with another army that's out there,
sure,
but you're doing something helpful for the king. We'll come back to that. The defender role was very different. And the defender role is where you were part of that army and you were trying to fight off enemies who were attacking the king. So if some kind of bad force showed up, or in the LSAT world, a bad idea, something that would attack the conclusion showed up, you were there in a defender role to kill that idea, to kill those enemies out there. And obviously it's really rough. It's not like, you're going to write a book about this that is focused on, we're defending the king.
Right.
But in a sense, that's what's really going on. And when we take it over to the LSAT, what you find is that supporters are those answers that link ideas together. They're often called bridges,
right,
or identify the missing gap or the missing link.
Well, let's talk about what that looks like typically coming out of a stimulus.
Yes. I think because the key thing here is that when it comes to these answers, these are typically easier to see because you're taking two pieces or more that exist in the argument and you're like, I'm going to connect those guys and that'll be my answer.
Yep.
So
to me, the identifier of a supporter, and not just to me, to anyone who knows what they're doing, is there's usually some rogue or novel idea or element in the conclusion itself. And a lot of times it catches you, not just by surprise, but it's a flooring moment. Or at least I have this hard reaction to it. I'm like, wait, what? Did I miss something? Where'd that come from? It takes a left turn. It's completely random, it feels like. That's a supporter assumption. Because the author has stated something based on his or her belief, but never made the belief explicit enough to get to that specific conclusion just from the premises.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I can typically, or anyone can typically spot a supporter. But if you're really clued into the specifics of conclusions in general, it makes this a much easier task.
That's why we often talk about focusing on the language of the conclusion.
For sure. Or in this case, the specific elements within it, the pieces being presented.
Yeah, and this is where they often get students. It's interesting. We talk a lot about like summarizing what you've read in the stimulus and making sure that you understand it in terms that are clear to you.
Right.
But at the same time, you have to be careful not to transform what is being said into something new or different. Mm-hmm. They love to have answers that look kind of like what was talked about in the conclusion or part of the argument, but have a couple of changes or missing pieces, and all of a sudden it's not the same. So you have to link something that you see as being new But a lot of times people sense this intuitively.
Right.
And this is why I feel like these questions are usually easier.
Mhm.
They're like, wait, there's a part missing.
Yeah.
Well, then your job becomes find that part.
Right. Casual readers are really giving up one of the greatest LSAT opportunities here. Because if you're not being extremely precise and diligent about what you read in conclusions and this occurs, it's easy to miss the fact that all you have to do is just make a bridge, connect a gap. These can be gimme questions if you're reading conclusions for the right idea.
Yeah. You see a whole, think about the things they can do with it.
Mm-hmm.
They can ask you to identify what would fit inside of it, which is an assumption. They can ask you to blow that hole apart and make it even bigger. Obviously, a weaken question.
Yeah.
You know, they can ask you, well, how is it that hole came about, which is like a flaw question. So whenever you look at the way arguments are structured and whether they're strong or weak or they have problems, usually you can figure out, well, how would they ask me a question about this?
Yeah.
But the assumption in some respects is the most direct way of addressing this because it's like, just tell me what is the missing piece.
Yes.
That's a nice task to be charged with when they give you support or answer as being a correct answer.
Let me provide a word of caution at this point, born out of watching some of my students get a little carried away with this. Because it is easy to get carried away. Like, oh, gap, and you just seize on the first answer choice that has the two pieces you want. Premise, conclusion, there's my pieces that I need to connect. It's A or B. There is a trap that they like to use, and they seem to be using it more and more. Remember that a conclusion is a destination. A conclusion is where that author's trying to arrive and get you to come with him or her and arrive at as well. The answer choice that does the connecting here not only has to have those same two pieces, premise and conclusion, to link them, to make a chain, it has to do it directionally so the conclusion is where you get to. Trap answers will have the pieces, but take you from the conclusion backwards. So,
which is a nice way of looking at it.
Yeah, don't
honestly.
just latch onto the first answer choice that's got the parts you want. Make sure those parts actually connect in a way that's going to traverse the gap appropriately. Premise
the
to
right
conclusion.
direction.
Yeah, that's right.
From premise to conclusion.
You have to.
A great example of something like that occurs in conditional reasoning, where you might need an answer that says A arrow B, and they give you an answer that says B arrow A.
Yeah.
And you're like, that's the wrong direction. That's a really simple way of thinking about it, but that illustrates that idea perfectly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it does.
Well, I do too. But honestly, if failing those traps, if you can just spot the pieces, these questions are some of the easiest on the test.
You're halfway there.
Yeah.
If not further.
If not done. Yeah, entirely.
So the supporter is the one that I think most people feel really comfortable with. They understand that idea. They can visualize that they're bridging this gap or finding the missing link. You often see it described in books that are talking in a superficial way about assumptions. They'll be like, go ahead and find that bridge. And it's like, yes, you are 100% right. The problem is when I was first looking at this, I kept running into answers where I'm like, this ain't no bridge.
Right.
You know, this isn't actually like working in a bridge fashion. And, you know, I could say I know why this is right, but to categorize that in a broad way and to understand the relationships between answers was what I was striving to do at that particular point. And that's really where these other types of answers started popping up, the defender answers. So those to me, I think, are a lot harder for the average student to see, especially at first. I think over time, it gets a lot easier. And that's because when you are there defending the conclusion, you don't know where the attack's coming from. You know, if you're back in that king and castle analogy, well, are they coming over the drawbridge or are they coming through the moat down the way? Are they going to try to like throw arrows at you? Is it, you know, flaming oil? I don't know, but you can't anticipate it. So what happens is in supporter assumptions, oftentimes people are able to prephrase, oh, this is the missing link.
Right.
In a defender assumption, trying to prephrase, way, way harder because there could be, in some instances, an infinite number of possible answers they could throw at you.
Well,
it's not likely.
Several, right. But any vulnerability.
Several will be more likely.
Let's go crazy. But any vulnerability in that argument becomes fair game as a point of necessary defense. And so knowing which of those you're going to do, there's 6 open windows and the back doors are unlocked. I don't know what to guard.
Yeah. And so prephrasing on defender assumptions can be impossible in some instances. You know, so I always say, if you do an assumption question and you think to yourself, all right, they just asked me for the assumption and nothing jumped out, look for a defender because that's probably where the attack's coming from. If you look at it and you're like, well, there was missing this, Okay, look for that. Doesn't mean it's going to be the answer, but your chances are fairly decent. Yeah. Anything that's hard to prephrase is more likely to be a defender.
Yeah, defender assumption stimuli tend to read as much more cohesive, coherent arguments. In fact, a lot of times you may read them and not even feel that there's some obvious mistake. Supporters, you tend to read and are like, oh, there's a gap. I see a hole.
Yeah, nothing's missing, or it doesn't feel like
that's
it's
defender.
Missing.
Yeah.
So I'll give a really brief, ridiculous example that'll kind of like flow along with the defender idea.
Looking forward to this.
So let's imagine that I have an argument that says people from California tend to be more attractive. And so that's the way it starts. And then they make the conclusion, well, it's being from California that causes them to be more attractive. So we have a causal conclusion. We'll just, we won't dive into the depths of what that means. We'll throw it out there. This is clearly a problematic argument. But this is designed to be simple and obvious. And in a case like this, if they're going to say that California is the cause, we'll just leave that there broadly. What they're also assuming is that other things aren't the cause. Right. It doesn't have to do with genetics or these other types of things that are out there, or the food that people are eating and so forth. That's not it. So any answer choice that came up that said, this is not the cause, that would fit into the defender idea. And it would be something that the author assumed, hey, it wasn't these things that caused it. It was California that caused it. And in making that argument, authors, especially on the LSAT, would typically assume for themselves that nothing else was the cause.
Yeah.
So
the first that occurs to me is the reversal, right? Like, maybe attractive people tend to move to California. It's not being.
I know you want that to be true.
I'm begging for it to be. Yeah, your argument didn't sound bad until the second half of it. And then I was like, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I can get on board with that first part. But that, to me, the potential reversal is one that's a real problem for that argument. If attractive people move here as opposed to come from here, the author has a problem. So what's that defender do? It denies that possibility. It removes from consideration this potential harm. But notice how impossible this is to prephrase with the same certainty as supporter. Any of those are fair game assumptions.
Yeah, you could think, all right, this might be prone to something like that. But in a lot of cases, you can't really see it coming.
Yeah, and it's almost dangerous to marry yourself with that degree of conviction.
Yes. We'll say this, though, that a lot of defender answers contain negative terms because they are actually knocking out things. The author thought to him or herself, that's not the case. And so a defender answer will often mirror that.
Yeah.
Does it have to? No, because we have double negatives and things like that and words with opposite meanings that we can use. So they don't have to have a negative in there, but you do see it quite a bit. And I'm not going to say it's a tip off, but it's something that I look for when I see these negatives. Yeah. There are ways to handle that, as we'll talk about momentarily.
They do like that negative language. Again, it's easy, I think, for people to want to marry themselves to some like mechanistic, algorithmic approach. So if I see one with negative language, I should pick it. It's like, no. There are ways to phrase things affirmatively, too, that do the same thing. Sure. Attractive people are more likely not to move to other states in California. That would be a fine defender.
Very good. That's exactly right. The thing, though, that makes it easy to skip over these defenders is if you've been raised on the idea that an assumption is a connector idea, when you see an answer with a negative in it, you're like, well, no, they're talking about something that's not there.
Right.
I'm looking for something that's there. And that's where the disconnect comes from. And so if you don't see these questions through this kind of prism, they can be really challenging because you are almost predisposed to avoid correct answers on defender type problems. Now, I do want to add this. When you are looking at the argument, you don't know whether or not it's a supporter or a defender type of model. That comes from the answer choices and how they're phrased. It's not the argument that falls into that. I know you're giving me that look like,
I am a little bit.
Wait a second. It's the answer and what role it plays that this refers to. And I'm not saying that some arguments aren't predisposed to be one type or another on the way they are built. I'm saying that you can't just read the argument and be like, this is for sure a supporter. Because you could have a supporter-looking argument that ends up with a defender answer.
Remember, this isn't every assumption. It's just any assumption.
Yeah. I'm just saying that when we talk about this model, it actually refers to the role the answer choice, the correct answer choice is playing in the problem.
Yeah.
And that's a distinction that I sometimes see people saying, well, I want to do a bunch of these arguments. I'm like, that's not quite how it works.
Right. No, okay, I agree with that. I like what you said before, too, that most people, I think, find themselves in the habit of looking for these gaps, these bridges. And if you're in the habit of just building bridges, it's really hard to see the utility in digging a moat, for instance. But they can both be of great service to whatever you're trying to protect or help out.
If you're trying to make the king live, you'll use any method possible.
Yeah. A bridge to helpful things and a moat against harmful things. Those are both really useful things to do. So it's that defense that I think a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah, agreed. So let's talk about one of the greatest of all tools to handle these questions.
Yes.
And that is the assumption negation technique. So it's built upon this model of necessity that we talked about, where we said if your argument, your conclusion is going to be valid, then it must be the case that your assumptions hold water or are true. So using that and thinking about like that house analogy and that foundation, what an assumption negation technique approach is doing is saying, well, if you are relying upon this piece in such a dramatic and powerful fashion, what happens if we take that away from you? What happens if I remove that thing that you've been clutching to, that you built your argument around or took as true on the way? What should happen at that point? Jon, if I were to come to your house and suddenly, magically, in Marvel-like universe fashion, just remove the foundation, what would happen to it?
Oh, it would collapse, which I think is what you're getting at. I use the lifeblood or the oxygen of an argument. What happens to you if I cut off your oxygen?
I'm dying.
Yeah, as
Unless
will
I'm Aquaman.
a conclusion when these assumptions aren't there or they're taken away.
And that, by the way, is the gist of how this works. And we're going to get into some of the technical aspects of it because I know everyone's excited by that. But the truth is that from a theoretical standpoint, if you really are building your argument on top of an assumption and it's a stepping stone that leads you all the way to the conclusion, man, if I take that away, the pathway just got a lot harder.
Yep.
The whole thing starts to call itself into question and the integrity is questioned. So that is the basic kind of like illustration of that particular idea. Now, the reason that it works is because it's actually a contrapositive. If your assumption is a necessary piece for your conclusion, well, take the contrapositive. What happens if you take away the assumption? Arrow over to your conclusion is now in trouble.
Yeah.
And so that's why you get a lot of conditional terminology like necessary assumption around all of this, because there is a way to see this where it really works very harmonically with that.
Precisely. Yeah. As soon as you lose the thing you require, you're in deep trouble. And that's how arguments operate here. And in fact, I'm fine taking it to extreme lengths and saying that when you actually perform this assumption negation technique appropriately on the correct answer choice, the argument won't just suffer. The argument collapses. Yeah. The game is over.
And that's on the LSAT, that is pretty much always how it works. But that, because you can get into like really complex arguments in little pieces, but this test tends to focus on the bigger, more central connection.
But it's also why this doesn't work on a strengthen question or a justify question. It's because they're not talking about dependency.
They aren't. And I think that's a really interesting point that will come up next week when we talk about these, because one of the things I wanted to talk about was, can you negate sufficient assumptions / justify answers and have it work? And I'm not a fan of that approach.
Yeah, spoiler alert.
in the next episode. But the difference is this, is because the task that's being played here is one where you have to have it. It is necessary. It is essential. It's critical. And when you take away something that's critical and you take away that lifeblood, it kills the host that's going on. So how do we do that?
Yeah.
I mean, how do we make that happen in the answer choices? What's our approach?
Well, it's interesting. I was going to actually apply it back to the example that you gave before about people from California more attractive because being from California makes you so. And let's think about what some assumption answers might be and then test them relative to things that aren't assumptions by this negation idea. So I think it's most helpful to see it in operation on things that are and aren't side by side. This is what it does to an assumption. This is what it does to a strengthen, for instance. So being from California makes you more attractive. This, by the way, is not the example I would have used. But we can do it. So one of the ones that I gave then is that more attractive people aren't moving to California. There's not something about California that draws attractive people in. It needs to produce them, not lure them, so to speak. Negate that. And take it to its logical opposition here, which is what we're looking for. What's the opposite of attractive people moving to California? They don't. They don't move there, or they move there less often. What would that do? What would it do if you did that? It would hurt the argument, right?
I think it would.
Yeah. So
that's all.
It's your example. I thought you might want to keep going with it.
No.
I've never.
You already said, this isn't the example I would use.
It's not.
Well, now you're off on your own race.
No, I jumped on your horse. The example I tend to give is maybe a little more simple, not even necessarily that conditional to that extent. But I usually just talk about like a very simple argument. Like I have a friend who's a great tennis player. I have a friend who's a great golfer. I'm sure anyone listening to this who's paid much attention has maybe even seen me use that example in places like Reddit or our forum in a blog post. Because those to me, I think, are very easy to talk about assumptions and negations for things that wouldn't. It's Masters Week, so if I said I had a friend who's a great golfer, some of the things that are required is that that person I'm talking about plays golf. Some of the things that are not required is that that person's Tiger Woods. The first one has to be true because if you negate it, my argument is finished.
But your argument is that your friend is a great golfer.
If I say I have a friend who's a great golfer, it needs to be true. It's an assumption that that person plays golf. How do we know? Yes. Test the opposite. I've known that guy his whole life. He's never swung a golf club. Then I'm wrong. My original argument fails. But if somebody came in there like, I know that person, that's not Tiger Woods, I can survive that. Because you can be a great golfer without being Tiger Woods.
These days, yes.
And in fact, for quite a long time, it helped not to be Tiger Woods, if that was your goal.
We're going to leave Tiger alone.
I know. It really feels like the wrong target for cheap shots, considering.
I'm not a big Tiger fan and never have been. Although I did actually see him tee off at the Masters.
You're not his type.
I don't know. He's got a great swing, or he used to. So he's a better golfer than I am, and we'll leave it at that.
I'll leave it at that for me, too. But you can start to see, or this person's won the Masters. Is that an assumption? No. How do you know? What if they haven't won the Masters? Can I still be correct? Can my friend still be a great golfer? Sure.
Could have won the British Open.
Yeah, or no tournaments. He's so good he doesn't like to compete because he feels bad for the people who finish second around.
Sure. Yeah. All sorts of options to still be great at that point.
That's why I probably won't do March Madness next year. I started to feel guilty.
Get out of town.
But that to me is a very easy way to start to see how this assumption negation technique not just works, but proves answers as required or not, because you can instantly see the effect on the conclusion when you negate. If it's not entirely detrimental, you do not have an assumption.
No, and of course that example that you're using is one of our favorite ones. It's one you hear in class a lot just because it's so good to be able to talk about the difference between strengthening it and justification versus assumption. And just as a comparison, if I were to come in and say, my friend has won the Masters, that's not a necessary condition, as Jon pointed out, but as we will see next week, that would most assuredly be a sufficient condition, and it would justify the argument. So the way these comparisons work is sometimes answers that would be right for one of them or wrong for one of them won't be wrong for another one. There's different ways of going about this, and that has everything to do with the comparison between the two tasks that we're talking about.
Yeah, which I think will become even more distinctive next week when we can see them operating side by side a little more closely.
Yeah, now you notice that what's happening is that as you're using that example, one of the things you're getting yourself into is you're trying to take away that defender answer. And the way you're doing that is you are turning it around on itself. You're literally turning it upside down. And typically what's happening to make that process occur is that you are negating the answer. And this is where assumption negation comes from, is because the idea behind that technique is if you're looking at an answer and you're considering it, if you negate it, meaning you change its meaning to the opposite, what should then happen is that it no longer will help the argument or is part of the argument, but it is now an active enemy of the argument and it attacks the argument. So this is, to me, one of the most powerful aspects of this tool is because you are taking an assumption answer choice and an assumption question, which most people find to be very, very difficult. These questions are often cited on the harder spectrum or the higher degree of difficulty spectrum when people look at LR. And you're turning it into a weakened question. And I always used to say in class, I was like, I don't know what this says about our society, but people are way better at weakening things than they are at strengthening them. And so you're taking a really hard question and momentarily completely transmuting it into a much easier type of question. So the idea of negation is in many instances most simply accomplished by throwing in things like a not or taking one out to turn things around, unless you're dealing with things like quantity, like every
Some
or something
or
like that.
all or none.
Yeah, then we go into opposition, and then, the opposite is not every, these types of things. And as you said, some, all, none, and all the variations that we have there. So oftentimes you're either negating terms like that, or you're throwing in a not or taking one out. And in doing so, you just have to make that mental switch where you're like, I'm no longer trying to help the argument. Now I'm looking to see if it weakens it. And if you negate an answer and it weakens the argument, it will be the correct answer. Every assumption, when negated, hurts the argument.
Yes.
This is an inviolable law. You must actually pass that test every single time. And one of the things that I'm a really big fan of is I like to talk about techniques that I know never fail.
Yeah.
So when we talk about this one, it's really important to realize if you go to an answer and you're like, I don't know, I don't really think it hurts it, but it's the best answer. If you don't think it hurts it and you're fairly confident that it doesn't, you missed something.
Yeah.
Some other answer is going to be the correct one. So
I'll point out too that this is supporter, defender. It works beautifully in either case. This is not tied to one or the other. If it's an assumption, regardless of type or construction, assumption negation will work to prove it.
Yeah. You think about your example before about your friend in the golf, and my friend can play the game.
Right.
Kind of being like that supporter type of idea. Well, what if I negate that and say, well, your friend cannot play the game? Okay, that's going to hurt the idea that they're a great golfer.
Yeah. It's worse than hurt, frankly. It's going to disprove. I'll give you my favorite one, which is if someone came to me and they're like, it's time we talked, you don't have any friends. That to me is the most psychologically that's brutal, but as far as my argument survival goes, that's the most damaging thing you could say. What do you mean you have a friend who's a great golfer? You have 0 friends. How do I know that's an assumption? Oh, again, you can test it.
Oh, I thought you were talking about your life. You're talking about the example still. Kidding.
Uh-huh.
You didn't like
Beer
that,
makes you mean tonight, man.
No, it's the weekend. I'm really tired.
Maybe
that's why you're drinking
made you mean.
Coffee. That wasn't mean. That was good anyway. You can leave me open for these shots, man. I'm taking them.
I can take it.
Yeah, you can. But I want to close this idea of the assumption negation technique, which is a brief conversation about it.
Yeah.
To really kind of like position it and make a very important point, which is that sometimes when you are exposed to a technique like this, which is so ultra powerful, the tendency is to want to use it all the time with assumption questions. And so I've worked with students before who are like, I love this. I can now understand how these questions work. And when I negate the answer, it automatically shows me whether or not it's correct. And so their immediate response to that is, I'm going to negate every single answer. I'll never miss another one. And the problem with that is it's too time consuming and it's too mentally draining to do that. You do not want to be negating 5 answer choices every time you do an assumption problem. That's just going to wear you out and it's going to slow you down. And I'm saying that, and I'm really good at negating statements. If you're struggling at all to do it, all of a sudden the drain, it's just going to kill your battery. So the way we look at this is you're not using it all the time. You are using it in really 2 instances. The first is when you are down to a couple contending answer choices. Maybe you didn't like 2 or 3 of the answers, but you're now having a hard time separating 2 or 3 answers. That's when you can use it. Be like, I want to separate between D and E. Let me negate both of them. Oh boy, D is a lot clearer now from this weekend perspective. That's my answer. The other time that you would use it is, all right, you've gotten down to an answer that you're pretty sure is correct, but you still have some hesitation or uncertainty. Negate it. If you see the weakness immediately, you're good to go. You can select that answer with confidence and move on.
Precisely, yeah. It's great to compare. It's great to validate, but you don't want to do this 5 times every time. What I found to be really useful is that you do this enough in practice and it becomes very second nature, almost intuitive. You're reading, and as part of your reading, you're already thinking about what the opposite would do or be. It becomes like a natural lens through which you see this stuff, but you really don't want to have to break down every answer to this degree.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
It's funny too, because Cameron, my daughter, was she woke up and for some reason said, it's opposite day. And this was fortunately only went on for about 45 minutes before she went to school. But every time I wanted her to do something, I had to say the opposite. So instead of me saying, hey, brush your teeth, I had to be like, don't brush your teeth. And all morning long, it was opposites. But you realize how easy it is to do it. It did work. She loved it. As soon as I gave her the opposite, she would go do what I was asking her technically not to do. So, but that's the kind of thing where if I'd done that for more than an hour, I would have been like, this has got to stop. Opposite day is over right now. This is killing me.
I don't know, man. If it worked, I feel like you just cracked some parenting code. She's a pretty good kid anyway, but
she's very good. So, but my 6-year-old could certainly get into it. It's just a matter of practice. And it's something that if you do it for a while, you fall into it, as you said, habitually, and it's a relatively easy thing. But we do it all the time.
Yeah.
That's really what my point was, is that this isn't something that is foreign to anybody. Little kids do it. It's just that when you get in this LSAT environment, all of a sudden you're thinking, I must be very technical.
Right.
I must be a logician. I'm wearing my white lab coat. And it's like, no, don't think about it that way. Don't divorce yourself from the problem. Stay close to it. Understand what's going on. Realize that you can be personalized with it. It makes such a huge difference in dealing with LR problems.
Yeah.
So
I agree. Although I will say, and we did this, remember when we did a evaluate question a few weeks back, and I ran through each answer choice in that question applying the variance test. As you practice assumptions, I am not going to have too tough a time if people want to practice by getting in the habit of negating everything. Just know that to take the test and actually finish, to be efficient when it counts, you can't approach it to do this 5 times for every assumption question. And you don't have to, thank God.
And that's a great point. We're not talking about practice. I'm talking about during a live fire test scenario, you are not wanting to negate every answer. But during practice, especially if you're learning it, negate everything.
Sure.
Find your partner and negate everything they say for a while. See how long it is before they get mad. And then you can just be like, it's opposite day. Don't worry about it, honey. Let's talk a little bit about something that we alluded to earlier. And that is the connection between the idea of a necessary assumption and what must be the case, and how the author might actually see those two things.
Yeah, this breaks a little bit, I think, from broad canon or historical approach, because most people have done exactly what we've described thus far. They see assumptions as requirements, often missing pieces, which is only half true. But there is another way to look at these that breaks from that idea of like an assumption and weaken type of relationship, like you just talked about with statement negation, and instead begins to look at these questions through a different angle or a different approach. If something's required by an argument, if an author believes something so fundamentally that the author feels it doesn't even need to be said out loud, that's how true it is to that person making the claim, then ultimately assumption questions are no different than must be true questions. Put another way, the correct assumption, the correct answer, is proven by the conclusion itself. As I often phrase this to students, you've got to approach the LSAT and any arguments that you see on here with the highest degree of skepticism possible. You don't just want to come into this open-minded or tolerant of arguments. You've got to put on a certain scrutiny. But assumption questions may be the sole exception to that. When I look at assumption questions and I know what that author's trying to convince me of, and I know it's assumption, I can then use that belief the author has to say, would that guarantee the author believes A? Treat them like must be true answers, and they fail. For the same reasons must be true answers fail. It's new information. I can't know that. It's the wrong language. It's too extreme, etc. This is a very unconventional, I think, way to think about these questions, but it's as valid as anything we've said.
It is. And it's interesting because what I've often said over the years is that an assumption question contains a huge must be true element. Mm-hmm. The author is relying upon this. The author has taken this to be true. They have to have it to be true. And a while back, I started to get asked about this question. Well, what's the difference? And I remember the first time I was asked it was a long time ago. I had to stop and think about how I'd place these two in perspective, context with each other. And it really came down to the idea that the must be true part for me, and I think you look at this similarly, but also slightly differently, is that must be true part is what's happening as a consequence of the argument. That typically, when you're asked a must-be-true question, you see the premises, the conclusion, or just the premises, depending upon how the problem's set up, and you're looking for something that's consequential from that follows from it. Whereas when you think about the must-be-true element in an assumption question, it's actually something that occurs on the way to making the argument, which is really the time travel aspect that we talked about before. So it's almost the before and after. An assumption is like before the arguments or as the argument's being formed, whereas a must-be-true question asks for that same element coming out of the argument.
Yeah. Well, if you think about conclusions as a destination, which I think is the phrase I used for them before, the destination's already been provided in an assumption question. So you're thinking about something inherent to the travel. In must-be-true, the destination, the conclusion's often the answer choice itself. So you have to be thinking about something as the final stage of the journey. But
I like that. It's well said.
Yeah, but that's how I see that relationship. And again, you can apply it to any example that you want. I used the example before about having a friend who's a great golf player or a great golfer. I guess you're not a golf player, but a great golfer. And I said things like, what would that require? But also, what would it prove? What would it tell you for sure? How many tournaments my friend's won, whether that person's better than me, if it's Tiger Woods? No. It would prove my friend plays golf, though. It would prove I have a friend, if you believe me. Please believe me. I need this.
See, I set you up. This was a long play for this joke at the end.
Oh, I got you.
I was just doing you a favor earlier. You didn't know it.
Thanks. But all of those things would be guaranteed by the argument. So to me, it's just two sides of the same coin. They're all required, but they're also proven. They're true. And the reason that I harp on this, at least for students and maybe right now, is because I think sometimes it's easier to see one versus the other. Sometimes you'll see that gap to close and you can just go find it. Sometimes you may not see the defender, but you can look at A and be like, that's not true. B's not true. I think C might be true. And then you've got a negation test if you want to apply it. So this is an extra tool in the arsenal, as I see it.
Yeah, and I really like it. Like I said before, that was well said. And I think that last argument example kind of brings the connection home as to how that works with that idea that must be true. How does it follow from it? Be like, oh yeah, it would prove that idea and make it clear. And it's really a different naming convention. You can call that a must or an assumption. It's the same idea, though. It's central to what's happening in the argument itself.
Yeah. And one great thing about this is as tough as assumption questions are for people, and you've made that claim several times, and I'm over here nodding vigorously. If you can do weaken, you can do assumption. They're just two versions of the same thing. If you can do must be true, you can do assumption. I think a lot of people almost intimidate themselves a little bit when they have the skills, if applied correctly, to do this question type. As I see
so many of the argument problems out there stem from problems with assumptions that were made while making the argument. And so getting good at this question type often makes you good at the others and vice versa.
Yeah.
So that's really kind of a cool way to close that portion out right there.
Yeah. Where I think you and I might diverge a little bit here is the specific approach we take. And I don't know. You might be making faces, or you might be nodding. But what I do for assumption questions is always treat them as a must be true first. Unless I see an obvious gap and I can just go close it. I always treat assumption questions like must be true. And that's the first run through answer choices that I take. And I see how many answers I can get rid of confidently as failing must be true type of analysis. And if any two are left or I'm not sure, then I'll negate.
You know, it's interesting because I would say I feel like we're describing the same process using different words. You know, I know what I'm looking for in an argument typically, and whether I feel like, all right, there's a gap there, or it's relatively obvious, or it's going to be some kind of defender thing. So as I look at these answers, I'm knocking them out relatively, hopefully quickly, and then getting down to a couple or one that I want, and then I'm actually negating. So I think the process is ultimately the same. The descriptor that you're using, though, with that must idea, I'm calling it more of an assumption.
Or requirement.
Yeah. And then that's the difference right there. But it's really the same process overall.
They amount to the same thing. It was a helpful distinction to make for me. That shift in my perspective, where I would look at A and not ask, like, does this need to be there? What happens if this isn't true? I would look at A and be like, do I know this for sure just on what I read? It's subtle, and it all kind of marries together in the end. But that was the first line of attack that I started to apply, and I found it just made things, for me, a lot easier. So if this is a question type you out there struggle with, flip the script a little bit. See if you can start to run through answers and eliminate them for not being true.
I like it.
All right. You got anything else?
No, I'm done. I'm losing my voice for some reason.
Okay.
I think the beer is actually causing me to not be able to talk clearly. Maybe I need to drink more beer. Is that the solution here?
Yeah, we'll get you a helmet for next time. We can get a cup strapped on. Funnel.
Bumpy ride coming. All right. Well, hopefully that kind of like overview of assumption questions gives you something to think about in terms of like really the broad-based aspect of what we're talking about, as well as some of the ways that we're able to view these answer choices and the techniques that we're able to use on them. We'll also expand on these ideas a little bit next time when we talk about justify/sufficient assumption questions, which will go hand in hand with the ideas we talked about today. So on Jon's behalf, we want to thank you and say we appreciate you listening. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube, and give us a rating if you can. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsat@powerscore.com or lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. Thanks so much and have a great week.